Dr. Sarah Bennett pushed through the double doors of Riverside Trauma Center at exactly 6 in the morning, her badge still smelling faintly of fresh plastic. She had transferred from a small rural hospital in Montana, a place where she had run entire emergency departments alone, stitched gunshot wounds by flashlight during storms, and once delivered a baby in the back of a pickup truck. None of that mattered here. Here she was just the new hire, an unfamiliar face in blue scrubs pushing a supply cart down a hallway that had already decided who she was before she said a single word. The whispers started before her first shift even ended. Two young residents, fresh out of their prestigious residency programs, leaned against the nurse's station and openly laughed as she walked past. "Small-town doctor," one of them muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Probably thinks a concussion protocol is asking someone to count fingers." His colleague snickered, arms crossed, clearly enjoying the show. Sarah kept walking, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed forward. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. Words from privileged young men who had never worked a shift without backup, without a full team, without the crushing silence of being the only doctor for 80 miles, were nothing compared to what she carried inside her. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that Sarah Bennett had spent 3 years as a combat trauma surgeon attached to a Marine forward surgical team, deployed to some of the most dangerous places on Earth. She had operated in dust storms with generators failing around her. She had held pressure on wounds while explosions rattled the walls of a converted shipping container that served as an operating room. She had lost patients, and she had saved more than she could count. And she had done it all without ever once needing anyone's approval or applause. She did not talk about it. She did not wear it like a badge. She simply carried it, quietly, the way people who have truly been tested tend to. The chief of surgery, a stern woman named Dr. Patricia Owens, had hired Sarah after a single conversation that lasted less than 20 minutes. Owens had seen something in her file that the residents hadn't bothered to look for. Exceptional outcomes in impossible conditions, a track record of decisions made under pressure that saved lives when there was no time to consult a textbook. But hospital politics ran deep, and reputation traveled slower than gossip. To the young doctors who had spent their lives in elite programs, a trauma doctor from a rural clinic in Montana was an easy target, someone to feel superior to in a system that rewarded arrogance dressed up as confidence. By her second week, the mockery had become almost routine. In the break room, someone would ask her loudly if she needed help reading an EKG, the sarcasm dripping from every word. In the hallway, nurses who admired her calm competence would occasionally shoot her sympathetic glances, unsure whether to intervene. Sarah never fought back. She simply worked. She arrived earlier than anyone else, stayed later, memorized every patient's chart before her shift began, and moved through the chaos of the trauma bay with a stillness that unsettled the people who expected her to crumble. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. It started as an ordinary afternoon, the emergency department humming with its usual controlled chaos, when the doors burst open and paramedics rushed in a patient in full cardiac arrest. The man was elderly, dressed in a crisp Marine Corps dress uniform, metals gleaming even as his chest failed to rise. He had collapsed during a hospital visit to honor wounded veterans, a ceremonial appearance that had turned into a nightmare in the span of seconds. The residents who had mocked Sarah froze, unsure of the protocol, fumbling with the defibrillator pads, their confidence evaporating the moment a real crisis demanded more than textbook knowledge. Sarah moved before anyone else could react. Her voice cut through the panic with a calm authority that silenced the room instantly. She called out orders with the precision of someone who had done this 100 times in far worse conditions, under far worse pressure, with far fewer resources. She positioned herself at the head of the bed, checked the airway, adjusted the compressions being performed by a nurse, and began directing the code with a clarity that made even the most senior attending physicians pause and watch. The two residents who had laughed at her days earlier now stood frozen at the edges of the room, watching a woman they had dismissed take command of a dying man's fate. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Sarah called for epinephrine, adjusted the rhythm analysis, and when the monitor showed a shockable rhythm, she personally guided the defibrillation with the same steady hands that had once worked in war zones halfway across the world. The room held its breath. Then finally a weak but steady heartbeat returned to the monitor. a rhythmic beeping that felt like the sweetest sound anyone in that trauma bay had heard in weeks. The old Marine's chest rose on its own. His eyes fluttered open, disoriented but alive. As the man was stabilized and wheeled toward the ICU, Sarah finally allowed herself to exhale, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a gloved hand. She had no idea in that moment that the true story was only beginning. She had no idea that the man she had just pulled back from the edge of death was not simply an elderly veteran attending a ceremony. He was a retired Marine Corps general, a man whose name carried weight in rooms most people would never enter, a man who did not forget faces or debts. And when he opened his eyes fully, when the fog of near-death cleared just enough for him to understand where he was and who had saved him, he asked for one thing: to see the doctor who had commanded that room like a battlefield surgeon. The residents who had mocked her stood in the hallway outside his room, their earlier laughter replaced by an uneasy silence, sensing that something had shifted in a way they didn't yet fully understand. Sarah Bennett, the small-town doctor they had dismissed as unworthy of this hospital, was about to become someone none of them would ever forget. If this story is pulling you in already, hit that subscribe button now, because Chapter 2 is where everything changes, and you will not want to miss a single moment of what happens next. Sarah stepped into the recovery room 2 hours after the code, still in the same scrubs, a faint tremor in her hands that only appeared once the adrenaline finally began to fade. General Marcus Hale sat propped up against a stack of pillows, and 4-line taped to his forearm, his uniform jacket folded neatly on a chair beside the bed by a nurse who had clearly taken care to preserve his dignity. His eyes, sharp despite everything his body had just endured, tracked her the moment she walked through the door. He did not smile immediately. He simply studied her, the way a man who had spent decades reading people in high-stakes situations tends to study everyone he meets. "You're the one who worked on me," he said, his voice raspy but firm. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, stepping closer to check his vitals on the monitor, falling back into the professional rhythm that had always been her refuge. The general watched her hands move with practiced efficiency, watched the way she read the numbers without needing to ask a nurse for clarification, watched the quiet confidence that radiated from someone who clearly did not need an audience to know her own competence. "Where did you train?" he asked. Sarah gave the brief, unremarkable answer she always gave, mentioning her residency, her time in Montana, careful as always not to mention the years that had shaped her more than any classroom ever could. But General Hale was not an ordinary patient, and he had not survived 4 decades in the Marine Corps by missing details. He noticed the faint scar along her forearm, one that matched the kind of injury caused by shrapnel rather than surgical practice. He noticed the way she had called out orders during the code, using cadence and terminology that belonged to combat medicine rather than civilian emergency rooms. He noticed the tattoo peeking out from beneath her scrub sleeve, a small insignia that most people would overlook but that he recognized instantly, having stood beside men and women who wore that same mark with pride earned in places most Americans would never see on a map. "You served," he said quietly, and this time it truly wasn't a question. Sarah paused, her hand hovering over his chart, and for the first time since arriving at Riverside Trauma Center, she allowed herself to answer honestly. She told him about the forward surgical team, about the years spent operating under conditions that would break most surgeons, about the choice she made afterward to disappear into a quiet rural practice because she no longer wanted recognition, only purpose. The general listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to profound respect, the kind that cannot be faked or rushed. Word of the conversation spread through the hospital faster than anyone could have predicted. By the time evening shift began, nurses were already whispering about the retired general in room 412, who had specifically requested that Dr. Bennett be assigned as his attending physician for the remainder of his stay. The 2 residents who had mocked her days earlier found themselves assigned to observe her rounds, ordered by Dr. Owens herself to shadow the very doctor they had dismissed as beneath them. They stood awkwardly outside his room, listening as the general spoke about Sarah's actions during the code, describing in vivid detail the calm precision that had brought him back from the edge of death. The moment that changed everything happened during morning rounds 3 days later, when General Hale insisted on standing against doctor's orders to properly thank the woman who had saved his life. The trauma bay staff gathered near the nurse's station, curious about the commotion, as the elderly Marine straightened his posture despite his physical exhaustion and addressed Sarah directly in front of everyone. His voice, though weakened by his ordeal, carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had commanded thousands. "In 40 years of service," he said, "I have seen brave men and women crumble under far less pressure than what I witnessed in that trauma bay. This doctor did not crumble. She commanded that room like a battlefield surgeon, because that is exactly what she is." He turned to the two residents who had spent weeks mocking her, his gaze steady and unflinching. "You have a legend working beside you, and you didn't even know it." The silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. The residents who had laughed at her small-town background, who had questioned her competence without ever bothering to learn her story, stood frozen under the weight of their own ignorance. Dr. Owens, standing at the edge of the group, allowed herself a small, knowing smile, having seen exactly this outcome coming from the moment she first read Sarah's file. Nurses who had quietly admired Sarah's competence from a distance now openly applauded, some wiping away unexpected tears, moved by the rawness of a truth finally spoken aloud in a place that thrives on hierarchy and reputation. Sarah stood in the center of it all, uncomfortable with the attention but unable to deny the shift she felt happening around her. She had never wanted recognition. She had built her entire career on quiet competence, on showing up and doing the work without needing validation from people who judged her before knowing anything real about her life. But something about hearing those words from a man who had earned the right to say them, a man who understood sacrifice and courage in ways few people ever would, settled something deep inside her that she hadn't realized needed settling. In the weeks that followed, the culture of that trauma department changed in ways both subtle and profound. The residents who had mocked her became some of her most attentive students, eager to learn from a woman whose calm under pressure they now understood came from a place of hard-earned wisdom rather than luck. Sarah never brought up the general's words again, never used them as leverage or pride, simply continued showing up every day with the same quiet dedication that had defined her entire career. But everyone in that hospital knew now what General Hale had recognized instantly: that true strength rarely announces itself, that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who has already survived the storms everyone else fears, and that judging someone by where they came from is always a mistake. If this story moved you even a little, make sure you're subscribed, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories about ordinary people who turn out to be extraordinary the moment life truly tests them, and you will not want to miss what comes next.